It had been 22 years since the night that tore their family apart, and yet the silence of unanswered questions still lingered in every corner of their lives. The Harrington family had been living in a small town on the edge of the state, where everyone knew one another and nothing ever seemed extraordinary until the night their eldest daughter, Claire, disappeared. She was 20 years old, bright, ambitious, and known for her kindness, the sort of person who was remembered even in casual encounters. Her sudden vanishing was like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples through the entire community. The police searched for weeks, volunteers combed through the woods, and the family held on to hope long after everyone else had stopped believing. But Claire never came home. A body was discovered 6 months later in a shallow grave not far from an abandoned mill, and though there were whispers and suspicions, no one was ever arrested. The case went cold, locked away in a filing cabinet where it gathered dust while her family lived with the ache of injustice. Claire's parents aged with their grief, carrying it in their bent shoulders and quiet dinners. Her younger brother, Michael, was only 15 at the time of her disappearance, but he grew up with her memory etched into every choice he made. He studied criminology at college, a decision fueled less by passion than by obsession. He told himself it was about justice in general, but deep down he knew it was about her, about finding what the police couldn't or wouldn't. By the time he was in his 30s, he had become a private investigator. He never spoke of his true motive, but those who knew him well could see that every case he took was a rehearsal for the one that haunted him most. The break came not from new evidence unearthed by the authorities, but from a chance encounter. Michael had been following a lead for an unrelated case when he overheard the name of a man who had lived near the mill in those days, a drifter who had slipped in and out of the town's memory. His name was Leonard Briggs. Michael remembered him vaguely, a rough man in his 40s at the time, with a violent temper, who had been questioned in Claire's case but never charged due to lack of evidence. Most had forgotten him, but not Michael. He tracked Leonard down, now living 2 towns over, working odd jobs, keeping to himself. What struck Michael was how time had not softened him. He still carried that aura of menace, the kind that made dogs bark and children cross the street. Michael dug deeper, quietly, without telling the police. He discovered that Leonard had a history of violence against women, charges that were dismissed or never pursued. More chilling were the patterns: women who disappeared briefly, who were later found battered, and one who had vanished entirely in another state. The case against him was circumstantial, but in Michael's gut, the puzzle was starting to take shape. He brought what he found to his parents, and for the first time in 2 decades, there was a spark in their eyes, not of hope, but of something harder, sharper. They had lived too long with helplessness, and now they were ready to act. The Harringtons became conspirators in their own quiet war. Michael staked out Leonard's home, learning his routines. Their mother, who had grown frail but fierce in her sorrow, suggested ways to lure him into revealing himself. Their father, once a reserved man, seemed almost transformed, speaking with cold determination. They didn't want an arrest. They wanted certainty, confession, closure on their own terms. Leonard had stolen more than Claire's life. He had stolen the family's peace, and now they meant to take something back. The opportunity came on a rainy night when Leonard stopped by a bar on the edge of town. Michael followed him inside, playing the role of a stranger, striking up conversation over drinks. Leonard, loosened by alcohol, proved to be boastful, cruel, and careless. Michael pushed, asking leading questions under the guise of camaraderie. It was then that Leonard, smirking into his glass, made an offhand remark that froze Michael's blood. He spoke of the girl from the mill, dismissing her as if she had been nothing more than an inconvenience. There it was, the acknowledgement he had sought for decades. Not a confession the police could use, but one the family would never forget. Michael left the bar, knowing what had to come next. With the help of his parents, they lured Leonard out days later, offering him work under a false name. When he arrived at the desolate location they had chosen, a stretch of woodland near where Claire's body had been found, the confrontation unfolded. They didn't kill him. That wasn't what they wanted. Instead, they made him see the faces of those he had wronged, hear the voices of the family he had shattered. Michael recorded every word as Leonard, cornered and desperate, admitted to what he had done that night 22 years ago. He had followed Claire, angry over a rejection, and in a fit of rage, he had taken her life. His words spilled out, ragged and broken, as the rain fell just as it had on the night of his careless boast. The Harringtons didn't strike him down. They left him there, shivering, knowing that his own words would now be his undoing. The recording was delivered anonymously to the authorities. Leonard was arrested within weeks, tried, and sentenced. In the eyes of the law, it was justice. But for the Harringtons, it was something more. It was victory carved from years of despair, a reclamation of power they thought had been lost forever. They never spoke publicly about the role they played. To the world, it was simply a cold case miraculously solved. But in the quiet of their home, they knew the truth. They had crafted their own justice, shaped their own ending. And as they sat together one evening, a framed photograph of Claire on the mantel, there was finally silence, not of unanswered questions, but of peace. For the first time in over 2 decades, the Harringtons could breathe. The perfect revenge was not in bloodshed or violence, but in ensuring that the man who thought he had buried their daughter's story would never escape it again. The years between Claire's death and Leonard's capture had not been a straight line of grief, but a jagged path that cut deeper with every turn. Michael often thought back to the night she vanished. He remembered the frantic hours, his parents shouting her name in the woods, the flashlight beams darting across trees. He remembered the silence afterward, the way hope turned brittle, snapping piece by piece as each day passed. He carried that silence with him, through college, through his work, through his nights lying awake staring at the ceiling. It was the kind of silence that carved itself into a person's bones. When he discovered Leonard, it felt at first like a ghost stepping out of memory. The man was older, heavier, his hair thinner and gray, but his eyes were the same, cold, dismissive, full of the kind of arrogance that comes from believing you've gotten away with something. Michael spent weeks circling him, learning his movements, tracing his history. Every discovery made his skin crawl. Women beaten and too afraid to press charges. Neighbors who remembered hearing screams. A job site where a young girl went missing, never to be seen again. Leonard had been a shadow moving from place to place, careful enough to leave no trail the police could hold. But Michael wasn't bound by procedure. He was bound only by memory. At home, he would bring pieces of his findings to his parents. His mother, Anna, who had once been gentle and soft-spoken, had grown into someone harder, sharper. Her voice would tremble when she asked questions, not from fear but from a rage held too long inside. His father, Robert, would sit with clenched fists, staring into nothing as though he could see Leonard's face there. They had been broken for so long, yet now, for the first time, there was unity. Their grief, once a weight pressing them into silence, became fuel. The night at the bar had been the turning point. Michael had felt his hands tremble as Leonard, drunk and reckless, let slip the words, "the girl from the mill." It was not a full confession, but it was proof that Claire lived in his memory, not as an accident or coincidence, but as something he carried and mocked. Michael recorded nothing that night. He wanted Leonard's own tongue to damn him under the right circumstances. And so, the plan was born. They chose the woods near the mill for a reason. That place had been Leonard's attempt at hiding the truth. It would now become the place he was forced to unearth it. The Harringtons prepared with precision. Michael used a false name and posed as a contractor, promising Leonard cash for a day's work clearing scrap. Leonard, always greedy, agreed. When he arrived, the family was waiting. Michael stood in the open clearing, his parents in the shadows. Leonard sneered when he saw Michael, as though he recognized something familiar. The confrontation was not loud, not violent. It was suffocating in its stillness. Michael spoke first, his voice low, steady. He asked about Claire. At first, Leonard laughed, denying everything. But Michael pressed, his words cutting with the precision of someone who had lived this moment in his head for years. He brought up details only Claire's killer could know. The ribbon she wore in her hair that night, the watch she had been given for her birthday, the dirt under her nails when they found her. Leonard's smirk faltered. His face twisted, caught between defiance and the weight of memory. And then it broke. Perhaps it was the isolation of the woods, the eyes of the family staring at him, the years of secrets gnawing at his pride. He began to talk. His words came in fragments, then in a flood. He admitted to following her, to anger boiling when she rejected his advances, to the moment he struck her and realized he'd gone too far. He spoke of panic, of dragging her body, of burying her in the shallow earth near the mill. Each sentence was a dagger, but the Harringtons did not flinch. Michael held his phone steady, recording every word. When Leonard finished, there was no satisfaction in his eyes, only emptiness. He knew then that his life was over, though the Harringtons had not touched him. They left him there, in the rain, broken by his own confession. The authorities received the recording anonymously. Michael never revealed how it had been obtained. All the police cared about was the clarity of the words, the precision of the details, the undeniable admission. Leonard was arrested. The trial was long, but the outcome was inevitable. The jury heard his voice describing the killing, and his fate was sealed. For the Harringtons, justice came not in the courtroom but in the silence afterward. Their home, once a place of mourning, began to fill again with laughter, hesitant at first, then steady. Anna tended her garden again, planting flowers Claire had loved. Robert took up his old woodworking, crafting frames and shelves as though rebuilding what had been lost. Michael finally slept through the night. They never told anyone about their role, about how they had drawn the truth from a man who thought he had buried it forever. To the world, it was a miracle, a cold case solved after 2 decades by a stroke of luck. But in the Harrington household, they knew better. They had written their own ending. The perfect revenge was not blood, not violence. It was ensuring that Leonard's final years would be spent in a cell, haunted by the truth he had tried to bury, while they lived on in peace, reclaiming what he had stolen. And in that quiet victory, they found not just justice for Claire, but a return to themselves. The town spoke of Claire Harrington's case for a few years after her death, and then, as with most tragedies, the whispers faded. New stories rose, new scandals replaced the old, and what had once been a wound in the community became a scar they didn't bother touching anymore. But for her family, time never dulled the pain. Anna would still set an extra plate at the table for months after Claire's disappearance, unable to accept the emptiness. Robert would sit in his truck for hours, parked near the old mill, staring into the woods like he expected his daughter to walk back out. And Michael, though only 15, carried his sister's absence as if it were stitched into his skin. By the time Michael reached adulthood, grief had shaped him into someone relentless. He was quiet, methodical, and learned to read people with unnerving accuracy. Friends admired his discipline, but none truly understood it. Every case he worked as a private investigator was a mirror reflecting back to his own unsolved pain. He wasn't chasing justice for strangers. He was rehearsing for the day he could chase it for Claire. Leonard Briggs became the center of his orbit slowly, like a dark planet pulling him in. At first it was nothing more than a name on a list of people questioned in 1999. But as Michael gathered old police files and pieced together timelines, Leonard's shape grew sharper. Witnesses remembered his temper. Ex-girlfriends recalled his cruelty. A waitress from the diner near the mill said he used to sit there late at night, staring into his coffee like he was hiding something. It wasn't proof, but it was smoke, and Michael had always trusted that where there was smoke, there was fire. The hardest part wasn't the investigation, it was involving his parents. For years, Michael had shielded them from the darkness he waded through. But one evening, as the three sat in their living room beneath the framed photograph of Claire smiling on her college orientation day, Michael told them what he had discovered. His voice didn't shake, but theirs did. His mother's eyes welled up as she asked question after question, and his father sat silent, his jaw locked tight. By the time Michael finished, the decision had already been made. They would no longer be passive victims. The weeks that followed were a blur of planning. They spoke in hushed voices at night, their conversations heavy with both dread and anticipation. The Harringtons were not people of violence. They weren't hardened criminals or vigilantes. They were an ordinary family who had been pushed past the breaking point. And in that breaking, they had found a terrible clarity. If the law could not give them truth, they would carve it out themselves. When Michael finally lured Leonard to the woods, the plan hinged on control, not rage. They wanted Leonard's words, not his blood. Michael confronted him directly, while Anna and Robert watched from the shadows, their presence heavy, silent reminders of the life he had destroyed. Leonard tried to laugh it off at first, tried to intimidate, but Michael's calm dismantled him piece by piece. There was no accusation shouted, no threats. Only quiet, piercing questions. Questions about the ribbon in Claire's hair. About the scrape on her bicycle found by the roadside. About the cut on her palm, likely from the broken glass bottle discovered near her body. Each detail was a blade. Eventually, Leonard's mask cracked. The words spilled out, ugly and raw. He had wanted control, he admitted. She had refused him, and he couldn't stand it. His rage had been quick, blinding, and when it was over, he buried her as though covering a mistake. Michael caught every word on his recorder, each syllable sealing Leonard's fate. And then came the silence. Leonard realized what he had done, not just years ago, but now. His eyes darted to the phone in Michael's hand, to the figures of Anna and Robert stepping out of the shadows. He knew, in that instant, that the life he had stolen would be the one to destroy him. The Harringtons left him there. They did not strike him or harm him. They didn't need to. His own confession would do what the police never could. When the recording reached the authorities, it sparked a storm. Detectives reopened the file, prosecutors built their case, and Leonard Briggs, for the first time in his life, faced the weight of his actions. His trial was grim, but the jury needed little convincing after hearing his own voice describing the crime. He was sentenced to life without parole. The newspapers called it a miracle break in a decades-old mystery. The police credited advancements in investigative persistence. The truth, however, belonged only to the Harringtons. In the quiet aftermath, the family found themselves transformed. Anna planted lilies by Claire's grave, whispering that justice had come at last. Robert built a wooden bench by the garden, where he and his wife would sit in the evenings, sometimes speaking, sometimes only holding hands in silence. Michael, for the first time since he was 15, allowed himself to imagine a future not bound by grief. But they all carried the same unspoken understanding. The world would never know that it had been their hands, not fate, not luck, that had turned the key in a locked case file. They had achieved what no one else could. They had taken back their power. And in that act, they found the perfect revenge, not by killing the man who took Claire from them, but by forcing him to live out his days in a cage of his own words, haunted by the ghost of the girl he thought he had silenced forever.